Okay. This is the start of the material for the second midterm. Our objectives. Here, let me just. Okay. Perdón, ¿había question?
No, esto no va para el examen del 16, del 15.
15.
No, right, okay.
Okay. So this is the start of the material for the second midterm. In general, the next 5 classes that we're going to have are all on markets. And our general objection is to explain how managers should respond to different competitive environments or market structures in terms of pricing and output decisions. Today, we're going to cover that in general, just the first few slides, and then we're going to talk about perfect competition. Later on, we'll talk about other market structures. Okay, market power. A firm's pricing market power depends on its competitive environment. In a perfectly competitive market, firms have no market power. They're price takers. That means whatever the price in the market, or whatever price the market dictates, they have to accept. They have no market power. If they raise price above that, nobody's going to buy from them. They make decisions based on market price, which they are powerless to influence because they're a small participant in the market and they can't really affect the total market supply and demand in any meaningful way. In markets that are not competitively, perfectly competitive, most firms have some degree of market power. In other words, they can vary their price somewhat. The strategy in the absence of market power, firms can't influence price because the product isn't unique, and they're not big enough to influence demand or supply, either by advertising or changing the price or any type of product differentiation. Managers in this environment maximize profit by minimizing costs and through efficient use of resources and by determining the quality to produce. Now, we saw last time that a profit maximizing firm sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. It's no different in a perfectly competitive market. It's just that there's so many other firms out there doing the same thing. You don't get to determine price. So under perfect competition, we have the following. We have a large number of buyers and sellers, right? Each firm in the industry produces a small amount of the total supply, and each customer buys only a small part of the total output. Product homogeneity. Homogeneity means everything's the same. In other words, everybody in a perfectly competitive market is selling the exact same thing. They can't differentiate their product from somebody else's. The output of each firm is perceived by customers to be essentially the same as output of any other firm in the industry. Free entry and exits. It's relatively easy and inexpensive to get in and out of this industry. Firms are not restricted from entering or leaving the industry. And finally, perfect dissemination of information. Cost, price, and product quality information is known by everybody, every buyer and seller in the market. Oops. Okay. So this is basically the same thing we just talked about. With the last bullet point, there's no non-price competition. In other words, advertising doesn't get you anything. You can't differentiate your product. Imperfect competition. Firms have some degree of market power and can determine prices strategically. Products may not be standardized. In other words, I can differentiate my product from others. And firms employ non-price competition, with the first one being product differentiation, And I can get that by advertising, branding, or public relations. When I have some market power, in general, there's probably going to be some barriers to entry, right, that make it hard for people to just jump in the market and compete with me. It may be some kind of cost barrier, which is probably the most common type of barrier to entry, but it can be something else. It can be a patent, some kind of government regulation, some kind of special know-how that people just can't copy. All of these things will will make it hard for other firms to enter and thus give you market power. Let me go back. Today we're going to cover perfect competition, and next week we'll cover monopoly, and then the next 2 weeks after that we're going to cover pricing strategies when you have market power. And these are things like we're going to study bundling. We're going to study different things or different types of price discriminations where I can charge different prices to different customers depending on the demand for my product, and that way I'll maximize profit. And then after that, we'll get into monopolistic competition and oligopoly. But for today, we're going to talk about perfect competition. Okay. So, as we've already said, under perfect competition, market price is determined, right, by the market. There's a market demand curve and a market supply curve. No individual firm can affect the market supply curve, and no individual consumer can affect the demand curve. So here we have an example. This is out of the book. I have two inverse demand curves, and I call them inverse demand curves because price is on the right-hand side and not quantity. So the first one, price equals 22 minus 0.5 QD, where QD is quantity demanded. My supply curve, price equals 4 plus 0.05 QS, where QS is quantity supplied. So what I want to do, right, is set price equal to price. I set demand equal to supply, and then I solve for Q, where I allow QS and QD to be, and I go ahead and solve for Q. And in this case, Q is going to be 24,000. And once I get 24,000, all I have to do is plug it back into either my supply or demand graph, and I'll get price equals 10. I'm assuming there's 1,000 firms in the market, and therefore, each firm, assuming we're going to divide it equally, will produce 24 units. That's 24,000 divided by 1,000. If one firm alters its output, in other words, tries to produce more than 24 units or less than 24 units, right, there is going to be virtually no effect on the market price. So each firm faces horizontal demand curve. Does everybody understand how I set supply equal to demand in our inverse supply and demand curves? You guys want me to do it? Okay. So I have our inverse demand curve. And as I said, I'm going to allow quantity demanded equals quantity supply. I have my inverse supply curve, which is equal to 4 plus 0.25. And then once I have them set equal, I just solve for Q. I take this 4 over here.
Exacto.
Does everybody see how I did that? Okay. And in the next few weeks, we're going to be doing stuff like this a lot. We're going to be setting supply equal to demand. Okay. Here's another example. Right? I have a hypothetical inverse demand curve. P equals 40 minus 0.0001 Q. This time, I'm not making Q in thousands, I'm just whatever it is. And I have inverse, excuse me, inverse hypothetical supply curve, negative 0.254 plus 0.000025 Q. I set prices equal to each other right here. I have 40 minus 0.001 Q minus negative 0.24 plus 0.000025 Q. I do the same thing over here. I take I take this over to this side. I take the negative 0.001 Q over to this side. And then I divide the 40 by 0.00125. And I solve for Q and I get 322,032. Once I do that, all I have to do is plug this number in to either my hypothetical supply curve or my hypothetical demand curve, and I get a price of 780. Questions? Okay. So that's two examples. So if I draw my hypothetical supply curve, right, and demand curve, the price will be determined, right, where they meet. That's our equilibrium point, and that's what we just did mathematically, right? In every perfectly competitive environment, all firms are price takers. As we said, they can't influence the price. They have to accept the price in the market. On the other hand, since a firm can produce as much as it wants without affecting the price, the individual firm's demand curve is a flat line. Every firm charges the same price because they can't affect price. So here we have the graph from the book. We have a hypothetical demand curve, a hypothetical supply curve from the first example, and we had a price of 10 and a quantity of 24,000 for the market. Right? Can everybody see that? I'll turn the lights on back in a second. Okay, so this is from our second example. We had a price of 780, and I used to have the quantity down here was 322,000 something. So this is our hypothetical supply curve. Our hypothetical demand curve has a price of 780. If I take that price of 780 onto the firm's demand curve, right, we have a perfectly elastic demand curve, which means it's perfectly flat. In other words, I can produce as much as I want, right? But the price that I charge is going to be 780, right? It's going to be along this demand curve. And the firm's demand curve under perfect competition is simply a flat horizontal line, and that means its demand is perfectly elastic. Okay. It's important for managers to understand what factors that cause supply and demand curves to shift. And we talked about, of course, we talked about demand and supply curves under perfect competition. We're talking about the market supply and demand. Right? Things like advances in technology, which cause supply to increase, or increasing input prices or changing input prices that cause supply to change. So As we learned last time, a profit maximizing firm will always set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Since the demand curve is flat, right, you have fixed prices, the firm's marginal revenue is fixed at the market price. And that's just that's just a fact, given that the firm has a perfectly elastic demand curve. In this case, marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We saw last time that when we had a downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue was always going to be below marginal cost. But when it becomes perfectly elastic, my change in revenue is simply the price, right? 780 in this case. Okay. So the firm is going to produce where price, which is always equal to marginal revenue with a perfectly elastic demand curve, is going to be equal to marginal cost to put us at the profit maximizing level for the firm. Mm-hmm. So in our second example, right, the firm's production decision, right, is as follows. I have a price of 780, and I have its cost function, 0.0049 q squared minus 0.02114 q plus 7.6. And then I just solve for q. The math is a little funky. I'll never ask you to do this. But if you remember from your algebra class in undergrad or high school, I just apply the quadratic formula here, and I get q equal to 440. Right? So each firm in this second example we have is going to produce a quantity of 440. In our first example, do the same thing as we saw. The market price was 10. Now we know total revenue by definition is price times quantity. The cost function for these firms from your book, and again, they pulled it out of the air, just like I did for the second example. So total cost is 1 plus 2q plus q squared. Profit, as we saw last time, is total revenue minus total cost. Total revenue is P times Q. P is 10. And total cost is given by the formula here. So I have 10 times Q minus 1 plus 2Q plus Q squared. Okay, so jumping ahead just a little, to maximize profits, what would I do? Or how could I figure out where the max profit is in terms of the quantity produced? Anybody? I have a profit function here. Right? Profit is equal to 10q minus 1 plus 2q plus q squared. So minus 1 minus 2q minus q squared. Right? How can I maximize, right, that profit function with respect to q? How do we maximize any function? I think I heard it. I'm sorry? Dime. Close. How do we maximize the function? Actually, it's going to be that marginal revenue with marginal cost in this case. But we find that out by maximizing profit. We can find it out other ways. But in this case, what would marginal revenue be? We know that price of 10. What would marginal revenue be? 10. What would marginal cost be? I'm sorry? I'm sorry? Okay, it's close. It actually would be 10 because we're setting it marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. So before we can do that, we have to solve for marginal cost. And how do we get marginal cost when you have total cost? What's our definition of marginal cost? I'm sorry? I think that's. Okay, perfect. It's our change in total cost with respect to Q, so we take the derivative or full cost function. And as the colleague said, it's 2 plus 2Q. That's taking the derivative. So I take the derivative of total revenue, I take the derivative of total cost, I set them equal. What's the other way to do that? I take, is by taking, help me out here, I take the, of our profit function. What do I do with the profit function to maximize it? Partial. Partial is close, but we don't need a partial because the only variable in here is Q. So I take the, what's the other word for partial if we only have one variable? The derivative. I take the derivative and I set that derivative equal to maximize. Zero. That's how we maximize the function, right? We take the derivative, set it equal to 0. We take the second derivative to make sure it's maximum. But in this case, we won't do that because I won't give you that much math. So I would take, right, the derivative of the profit function and set it equal to 0. And just by coincidence, the first part, right, of that derivative would be our marginal revenue, and the second part would be marginal cost. So I'd have marginal revenue minus marginal cost equals 0, which means marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Like I said, I was getting ahead. I was kind of hoping it would be easier, but that's okay. I know it's a long day. So here we have a table from our example, right? We have the amount of output we produce. We have our price, which is steady at $10, and then we have our total revenue. And our total revenue is just P times Q, so 10, 20, 30, 40, etc. I have my fixed cost, right, from our formula, which is $1. I have my variable costs, which when I produce 0, it's 0, when I produce 1, it's 3, when I produce 2, it's 8, 3, 15, and so on. I add up total cost and variable cost. I'm sorry, fixed cost and variable cost, and I get total cost, right? And then I just take, right, my total revenue minus my total cost, and that gives me profit. And in this case, I can see that profit is maximized, right, here at 4 units. So each firm, right, in this perfectly competitive industry, we're assuming they're all the same. They have the same cost function and the same total revenue function. They maximize at 4, and they'll have a profit of $15 when they produce 4 units. Questions? Okay. So here's a graph. I have my total revenue, right, which is increasing by 10 each time. I have my total cost function, and the biggest separation between the two, where profit are maximized, is here at 4 units. Finally, I have my profit function, right, and we saw that profit was just total revenue minus total cost. And I see my profit is also maximized at 4 units, and where that slope is maximized, it's equal to 0. So that's our change in profits with respect to quantity. Okay. This is an example from our, I'm sorry, this is our second example, or graph from our second example. In this case, right, price of $7.80, and I set that equal, right, to, in this case, our long run marginal cost curve. And each firm produces 440. As we're going to see later on, the difference between where price equals our long run marginal cost curve and down here where that quantity intersects our long run average cost curve, right, gives us how much profit this firm is making. So it's basically making this yellow triangle here. So that's 440 times the difference between the price, which is 780, and our long run average cost, which we haven't talked about. And that gives, I multiply that by 440, and that gives me my total profit. So in that last graph, that firm's making an economic profit, and profit was equal to that yellow triangle. The industry supply is just the sum of each firm in the industry, right? Since each firm produces where marginal cost equals price, then the industry supply curve is simply the summation of all the individual marginal cost curves. What that means is that each individual firm's supply curve is the upward sloping portion of their marginal cost curve. Okay. So here's an example. I have, anyway, I have the marginal cost of the first firm plus the marginal cost of the second firm. In this case, if I only had two firms in the market, right, would give me the market supply curve for each price, in this case, whatever price this is, and that's just Q1 or Q2. This is the market supply curve, which is just the horizontal summation of all the individual supply curves for each individual firm in the market. Since there are no barriers to entry, when firms in a perfectly competitive market are making an economic profit, and remember, what's our definition of economic profit? Okay. Total revenue minus total cost, that's good, but when we talk about economic profit, we're adding something to the cost.
The fixed cost.
Opportunity cost. In other words, I'm in this industry and I have my capital. I spent money to buy whatever I need to be in this industry, and I'm doing the work. My opportunity cost is what I could be making if I worked for somebody else, or the next best alternative. That's our economic profit. So if I could make better in this industry than I can working for somebody else, and I'm making an economic profit here, you're going to have entry into this industry, right? Since there are no barriers to entry, right, firms will enter seeking these excess profits, and this is going to increase market supply. And when market supply increases or shifts to the right, the price decreases, right? And the price will keep decreasing until there's no more incentive to enter this market. And that'll happen when economic profits are driven to zero. In other words, I'm not doing any better in this market than I could working for somebody else or doing something else, right? So in the long run, right, in a perfectly competitive market, economic profits are zero, where price is going to equal long run average cost, and it's always going to equal long run marginal cost because that's our profit maximizing point. Questions? So this is how it looks in the long run. We have a price. I don't know what that price is. I haven't been doing the calculation. Right? I have my long run average cost curve, and I have my long run marginal cost curve. They all intersect at the same price, giving me an economic profit of 0. Profit is maximized at the quantity of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and marginal cost is increasing. This slide should have been up further. Sorry, guys. And in this case, from our second, from our first example, marginal revenue is equal to 10. Marginal cost, as you told me, is 2 plus 2Q. I set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. I get Q equals 4, just like we did before in the table. Okay. So in this case, marginal revenue equals marginal cost at 4. Just like we got mathematically. And graphically, I have my marginal cost curve upward sloping. I have my horizontal demand curve at 10, and they intersect at 4 units of output. Another example, graphic. Here I have a firm, and I'm going to assume that all the firms in the industry are the same. So I have firm 1 here, and it has positive economic profits, right, by this greenish rectangle. So that's the difference between the price they sell at and my average cost, right, which is here, right? So at P1, at P2, they're making an economic profit. As firms enter the market, supply shifts to the right from S1 to S2, and it keeps doing so until it reaches, right, a price of P1, and at P1, right, price equals marginal cost equals average cost. And these are, of course, long run marginal and average costs. Okay. Suppose we have the following. Suppose I have an industry, right, where initially the price is up here. And for some reason, demand, right, decreases and shifts to the left towards the origin. Shifts down here. Down here at this price, right, where price equals marginal cost is at Q1, and this Q1 should be here. Firms in this case start making an economic loss. In other words, they're doing worse here in this industry than you could do, you know, folding up and working for somebody else. When that happens, right, and I don't show it in this graph, but when that happens, supply will shift, excuse me, supply will shift back, and it'll shift back until the point where marginal cost equals average cost equals price. Right? So there'll be less firms in the industry, right? Price will increase, and eventually each firm will make 0 economic profits again. So in the long run, will they have an economic profit where people are entering the industry to take advantage of that profit, or an economic loss where people are leaving the industry to get away from the loss, right? Prices, or excuse me, profits or economic profits always go back to 0 in a perfectly competitive industry. Okay. Now, when the firm shut down, right, in a perfectly competitive industry, well, that depends on whether you're talking about the long run or the short run. In the short run, you have fixed costs. And in many cases, those fixed costs occur whether you're operating or not. Okay? So the shutdown point in the short run is going to be when price equals the minimum average variable cost. Right? At that point, you're still making a loss, right, in the short run, but you're at least covering your fixed costs. Right? So if price is greater than average variable costs, right, I produce a level of output in which marginal cost is equal to price, even if this results in negative profit. Profits will exceed that which results from shutting down. So if price is less than the average variable cost, I shut down and produce no output. Negative profits will equal total fixed costs. And we're going to see that in the next graph. Since fixed costs are incurred where the company operates or not, it should not shut down in the short run at P2. So this is our graph. So I have three prices. P3, actually I have four prices. At P3 is right where price equals the minimum of the average variable cost, and of course equals marginal cost. Right? At that point, I'm indifferent between continue to operate or not, right? Because I'm making a loss, but my loss is the same whether I continue to operate or shut down. Here at P1, I'm definitely going to shut down, no matter what, short run or long run. At P2, in the short run, right, I'm going to continue to operate because I'm covering my variable costs. I'm still making a loss, but I'm covering my variable cost. Right? And here at P0, I'm actually making an economic profit, so there's no problem. I continue to operate. At P2, I will eventually shut down, but in the short run, I'll continue because I'm covering my variable costs. At P3, I'm indifferent, and at P1, I definitely shut down. Okay. Another way of viewing the price equals marginal cost profit maximizing rule is as follows. If a firm has one fixed input, we're going to say capital, and one variable input, labor. We've already done this before. How much of its variable input should it utilize? Well, the way we figured this out is by setting marginal revenue product. You guys remember what marginal revenue product was? We covered it last week. Anybody? Actually, you can look at the slide behind me. Okay. Marginal revenue product, by definition, is marginal revenue times the marginal product. In this case, we're talking about labor, so it's marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. Now, in general, it's the change in total revenue divided by our change in whatever input we're talking about, in this case, labor. I can rewrite that as total revenue with respect to the change in Q times the change in Q with respect to the change in labor. Now, here, right, this is marginal product, and this is total revenue. Mathematically, it's just a math trick. I multiply by 1. I multiply by the change in Q over the change in Q, and rewrite the equation. Conceptually, it's just how much extra revenue am I getting for that extra output that last labor is giving me. Remember, marginal product is simply how much extra output do I get from that last unit of input, in this case, labor. So I hire the last worker, how much output does he give me? And I multiply that by the added revenue from that output. In other words, how much extra money do I get from what that guy produces for me? Now, to maximize profits, right, I want to set that, right, that revenue I get from that last unit of input equal to, right, how much I'm spending on that last unit of input. Now, if I'm paying everybody the same wage and the wages are fixed, I just call that the wage rate. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the wage rate, which is why we have our marginal expenditure on labor. Right? How much more am I spending on that last unit or that last worker? It's the amount of additional units of labor adds to my total costs. So my marginal expenditure on labor is a change in total costs with respect to the change in labor. I do that same little math trick, which is a change in total cost with respect to Q times the change in Q with respect to labor. I just multiplied by change in Q over change in Q. This is marginal cost, and this is the marginal product of labor. So I set them equal, right? My marginal revenue product is equal to my marginal expenditure, right? In this case, for labor, I have marginal revenue equals my marginal product of labor, and that's going to equal marginal expenditure, which is my marginal cost times my marginal product of labor. And of course, I have marginal product on both sides, so I have marginal revenue equals marginal cost. When I started graduate school a long time ago, I TA'd for a basic economic class, and the professor spent half the time explaining this, that the marginal revenue product of labor equals the marginal expenditure. And he didn't even talk about marginal expenditure. He just said wages are fixed, so the marginal revenue product equals the wage rate. And that's all we have here. Okay. Producer surplus in the long run. Producer surplus is just the difference between the market price and the price the producer is willing to receive for the good and service that he's producing. In other words, the supplier's reservation price. How much was he willing to sell versus how much he got for his product, right? A firm's reservation price is the marginal cost of the production above the shutdown point. In other words, from my average variable cost, right, the minimum average variable cost curve, all the way up the upward sloping portion of the marginal cost curve. Producer surplus is the difference between the firm supply curve and the market price under perfect competition, right? So here it is. Can you guys see the shaded area? That shaded area is below price, but above, right, the firm supply curve, right, is producer surplus. This area right here. So if I drew it with the linear demand curve without a linear marginal cost curve, the producer surplus would just be that triangle. That's producer surplus. That's the difference between what the firm receives and what it's willing to produce at any given price, below real price, below actual price. So it's that, by the way, that curve is supposed to be horizontal. It's not supposed to be upward sloping. But I drew it a little bit upward sloping there on the board. Sorry. Just so I don't confuse anybody, let me try to draw it again. Okay. So this triangle here, that's producer surplus. Okay. There we go. Questions on producer surplus? Simply, right, the area above the supply curve, but below the price. In other words, I was willing to sell this many units at this price, but I didn't have to because I received this price up here. And so that's my surplus. And I do that for every point, right? Below the equilibrium quantity, or to the left of the equilibrium quantity, I sum those up and it gives me that area here, B, known as producer surplus. This area up here, and we'll talk about this later on, A That's known as consumer surplus. That's the difference between what a consumer was willing to pay and what they actually had to pay. But for now, right, we're concentrating on producer surplus. Okay. So here it is. If I have a market demand curve and a market supply curve, right, A plus B, A being consumer surplus, B being, excuse me, producer surplus, right? Economics tend to think of that as social welfare. In other words, this is what I was willing to pay or what I was willing to produce at different prices, but I got a better price, right? So A plus B, right, is known as the welfare to the consumers and producers of the market. Okay. Questions? Okay, long run equilibrium of a perfectly competitive firm. We've actually already did this because for some reason my slides got out of order, but we'll do it again. The quantity produced is such that profits is equal to zero. And what type of profits are we talking about? Accounting profits? Economic profits, right? So economic profits are equal to zero. That means price is going to be equal to lowest point on the long run average cost curve, right? And the relative short run total cost curve we'll talk about. A long run marginal cost curve and a short run marginal cost curve will all be at the same point at that level. If firms are earning negative economic profit, then firms will exit the industry. Market supply will decrease and the price will rise to the long run equilibrium level. If firms are earning a positive profit, then firms will enter the industry. Market supply will increase and price will fall to the long run equilibrium level. So here it is, right? I have my long run average cost curve. I have my short run average cost curve. This is A to A prime. I have my long run marginal cost curve, this dark yellow line, and I have my short run marginal cost curve. Okay. And in the long run, I'm going to be at that point where there are zero economic profits. Now, in general, for that to be true, what I was assuming was that costs or input costs remain constant. Okay. So in a constant cost industry, right, an industry in which the increase in output does not lead to an increase in input prices, right? I have a horizontal long run supply curve, right? Like this. What happens? I have a short run marginal cost curve, a short run average cost curve. In the short run, for whatever reason, price increases to 7, right? In that case, what I have is increasing, excuse me, I have increasing industry supply, driving the price back down to 6, and causing this firm to go from producing 6 back to producing 5 units. But you'll have a lot more firms, right, producing 5 units. But what would happen if I have an increasing cost industry? This is pretty much what we've been talking about up to this point. But if I have an increasing cost industry, oops. So this was the firm. This is the market. Initially, I have an increase in demand. Price increases from 6 to 7. And what happens when firms see that? They enter the market. Supply shifts to the right, shifts out and to the right. And right here with the new demand equals a new supply at the old price of 6. In other words, each firm's producing 5, just like they did before at the price of 6, but now they're more firms. So you get more total output in the industry. Questions? Okay. I was getting ahead of myself. What happens if we have an increasing cost industry. The industry in which output leads to an increase in input prices. Our upward sloping long-run supply curve instead of a horizontal long-run supply curve. Right? So in this case, right, I start off at 6, and for whatever reason, right, the price goes up to 7. But in this case, when the price goes up to 7, I demand more inputs, and the price in those markets, those input markets, increases. So what I do, right, is I go from 5 here to 6 here, and I have a new long-run average cost curve, a new short-run average cost curve, and a new marginal cost curve. What that means is what price would actually do, and it's not shown in this graph, but price actually, initially, when demand increases, will increase to a price above 7. Right? And at that point, right, there'd be an economic profit and people supply more, but the price will only decrease back to 7. Why? Because now input prices have risen. So that makes my average cost curve, my long-run average cost curve, and my long-run marginal cost curve higher. So it goes back down to 7. I connect the 2 dots, and I get my long-run supply curve, which is no longer flat. In this case, because input prices have increased, it's upward sloping. As we saw here in this, or there's a bullet point, some industries are decreasing cost industries, i.e. that when the demand increases, right, price will increase, but then supply will decrease, the input prices will come down, and what happens? Supply increases even more, and what you have is prices decrease in the short run, and what you get is a downward sloping long-run supply curve, which is very hard for our equilibriums, but and it's actually very rare, even though they say some industries, very few industries are decreasing cost industries. And virtually none are perfectly competitive decreasing cost industries. Okay, so let's do an example. And in this case, I'm going to assume, again, going back, that these are constant cost industries. I have 2 industries. I have the industry for corn, right? We have corn farmers, and the industry for rice farmers. Right? I'm going to assume that in the short run, right, the demand for corn increases and the demand for rice decreases. Okay? So in the short run, the price of corn will increase because the demand increase. The quantity of corn produced will increase because we have an upward sloping supply curve. And corn producers will earn a positive economic profit. Okay? The price of rice, on the other hand, will decrease, right? The quantity of rice produced will decrease, again, because we have an upward sloping supply curve. And rice producers will start to earn a negative economic profit. Firms will reallocate resources away from the production of rice toward the production of corn. Right? So what that means is the supply of corn will increase, or the supply curve will shift to the right, okay, for corn. And the supply curve for rice will shift to the left. Right? So the price of corn will decrease from its high. The quantity of corn produced will increase further, and corn producers will find that their economic profits decline to 0. On the other hand, the price of rice will increase from its low, the quantity of rice produced will increase from its low, and rice producers will find that their economic profits rise to 0. So let's do this graphically. Got the corn over here. I have a supply curve. I have an original demand curve. And for whatever reason, the demand for corn increases. Right? So initially, what we have is an increase in price and an increase in quantity. For rice, on the other hand, passion and culture. Demand will decrease from D to D prime. Price will decrease from P to P prime, and Q will decrease from Q to Q prime. Now, be careful, because here I say the quantity of corn produced will increase, right? It will increase from this point to this point. But so far, right, that's just an increase in the quantity supplied. It's not an increase in supply because the supply curve stays the same. Right? And that, I know it's just semantics, but it's something that we have to do to keep it straight in the heads. Over here, the quantity produced decreases, and the quantity supplied decreases, but supply stays the same, right? We just move from this point to this point on the curve. Now, over here, I assume that corn producers are now making an economic profit. What that means is more corn will be produced either by people entering the market, as we assume, or corn farmers just dedicate more acreage to corn. So in this case, supply shifts out, the price comes down, this concept causation. Price comes down to the original price, and the quantity produced in the market is even greater, to Q double prime. In this case, for rice, quantity will decrease to Q double prime. Price will go back up to the original price, and economic profit will be zero again. Right? Again, I'm assuming constant costs. I could have assumed increasing costs, which in that case, the price would have been above P here and below P here. Questions? Okay, I'm seeing a bunch of blank stares. So those blank stares tell me you have questions. Help me out here. I don't know what to do or how to do it unless I get to know.
We comparing two different markets, rice and corn, we find different products. Is that what we're doing? Comparing two different products.
We're comparing two different products, and we're doing that because we're assuming that demand changes for the products. I assume that the demand for corn increased, and at the same time, the demand for rice decreased. So we get production away from rice towards corn. So in the end, assuming constant input prices, right, the quantity of corn increases by quite a bit, and the quantity of rice decreases. And in the end, they go back both to making zero economic profit. I know you guys have 2 weeks, but you really need to start studying for the test. I was kind of hoping you guys would have already started. Are there any questions at all about anything from the first return that we haven't had yet? Okay. Any questions at all related to the class?
Una pregunta durante la semana.
Me pueden mandar por email. Tengo horas de oficina, o podemos hacer un acuerdo para reunir.
Para el examen, ¿es solamente teoría o matemática, o ambas?
Okay. Like I said, I never know how to answer that question, especially when it comes about theory. The midterms gonna look a lot like the problems that I didn't assign you, but I put on the webpage. You'll get 5 questions. They'll be worth 20 points each, and like I said, you have 2 hours and 50 minutes to complete the test.
¿Debemos venir preparados para demostrar gráficamente algún ejercicio o...?
Gráficamente y matemáticamente, pero I'll probably give you a little more equations than I do graphs. Nobody's asked, but I let students bring in a 3x5 card, and you can write anything you want on that 3x5 card. Since you guys are giving me those blanks there, you can write front and back. So in other words, I don't want you memorizing formulas, or things like that. I want you to know the concept, but more importantly, I want you to be able to apply the concept.
Yo no voy a hacer
They're 3x5, right? I can't remember.
It's an index card, right?
Yeah, there you go. Tell you what, what's the next size?
La más grande es esta. Tiene por 5. Tiene por 5. 6 por 4. 6 por 8. No, 6 por 8.
Yo creo 6x4.
6 por 4.
Yeah, you can use up to a 6x4 index card. Front and back.
Sí, eso me puso con...
Okay.